Forgive them, not yourself. That phrase, it feels like a twist, like a betrayal of the usual self-help narrative. We're told that forgiveness is a gift that we give ourselves, that it frees you from that burden, that it's a way to heal. And yet, what if forgiveness isn't always meant for the self? What if sometimes the act of forgiving others is necessary, but forgiving yourself is a mistake? Consider this. How often do we shift the blame to somewhere that it doesn't actually belong? How often do we carry a weight that was never ours to actually carry to begin with? The mistakes, the betrayals, the wounds, they came from other people, yet somehow we make ourselves the judge and the jury and the executioner of our own spirit. Dostoevsky, who knew that the depths of human torment were beyond comprehension, understood this paradox very intimately. His characters all carry very unbearable guilt, often for sins that they never actually committed or for actions that were beyond their control. Guilt becomes their prison, self-imposed and merciless. Forgiving them, the people that hurt you, deceived you and abandoned you, can be an act of liberation. It shouldn't be a weakness, but instead a recognition that holding on to the anger that only corrodes your soul is a mistake, obviously. However, forgiving yourself when you are never truly at fault can also be a trap. It's a trap because it obscures the truth. You forgive yourself for letting it happen, for not being stronger, or for not seeing it coming. However, that self-forgiveness often masks deep self-betrayal. It's a refusal to see the real dynamics at play. Who told you that responsibility for others' cruelty lies in your hands? Why do you bear the burden of their failures? To forgive yourself too soon is to give up that fight for your own justice. It's to accept a narrative that you were weak and that you deserved it and that the pain is actually your fault. And no true healing can ever come from that soil. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote a lot about responsibility, but not in the way that we commonly think of it. He said that true responsibility is infinite and it's an endless ethical demand to the other person. Yet if this responsibility simply becomes self-abnegation, then it ceases to be ethical and instead it just becomes self-destruction. There's a boundary between accepting your fate and your role in your own growth and carrying that guilt that belongs to other people. That boundary is often blurred, but it must be reclaimed and re-understood. Forgive them for the fractures that they caused, for the breaks that they introduced in your life structure, but do not rush to forgive yourself for surviving those breaks. Survival itself can feel like failure when you're caught in the lies of self-blame. However, enduring, even with the scars, is the truest form of strength. It is not your sin to forgive, but instead it is your right to acknowledge. This isn't, however, an invitation to bitterness or endless grievance or some nihilistic outlook. Forgiveness towards others can still free your heart. However, withholding forgiveness from yourself, not as a punishment, but instead as a refusal to surrender the truth, can also be a necessary guard. It says that, I'm not going to soften the edges of my story to make other people comfortable, and I'm not going to erase the wrongs done to me just in the name of peace. I will hold myself accountable, but only for what is truly mine. That level of honesty is brutal, but it's also necessary because it demands you to see your pain clearly instead of distorting it with false mercy. It demands confrontation with injustice, both external and internal. Forgiving yourself prematurely often arises from some sort of fear. The fear of being angry from too long, or the fear of being too difficult, or even the fear that no one will stay if you never let it go. But that fear silences a necessary process. Real forgiveness, especially the kind that genuinely brings you freedom, is never going to be easy or intimate. It isn't the erasure of wrongs, but instead the transformation of how you carry them. Once you forgive them and refuse to forgive yourself blindly, you reclaim your own narrative, your own story. You stop playing the victim who bends to their timeline, the abuser's rules, and instead you give yourself permission to grieve and to rage and to rebuild. This is that paradox that Dostoevsky wrestled with and wrote about so much. It's the human soul's capacity to endure guilt and, look for that hope of redemption. It is messy and it is so incomplete, but it's also such an ongoing process, and it's also honest. And honesty, as I've said before, is the first step to true and genuine healing. So forgive them, let go of the bitterness that changed you, but guard your own heart against false absolution. Because in the space where forgiveness and truth meet and they collaborate, you find not surrender, but instead freedom. And that freedom begins once you stop forgiving yourself for what was never yours to carry.